Everyone knows who Thomas the Tank Engine is. The show itself is almost 40 years old, and the books on which the show is based are nearly 80 years old. So what made this little blue train so special? The short answer is a lot. This video won't be a huge in-depth analysis, but rather a brief overview of some of the different elements that I believe made the first 5 series so great.
Dear Christopher, here is your friend Thomas the Tank Engine. He wanted to come out of his station yard and see the world. These stories tell you how he did it. I hope you will like them, because you helped me to make them. Your loving Daddy.
I had a railway background, and quite naturally the interest transferred itself to my son, and when he was ill with measles at the age of 3, it was most natural for me to tell him stories about trains.
He remembered a rhyme from his own childhood. Early in the morning, down by the station, see the little engines all in a row. Along comes the driver, pulls the little lever, beep, beep, and off we go. And because words perhaps aren't terribly interesting to a 2-year-old, he drew a picture to go with it. They all had faces, and one of the faces was a sad one. And this drew perhaps the inevitable question, why is he sad, Daddy? Well, he said, he hasn't been out for a long time. Why hasn't he been out for a long time, Daddy? Well, the other engines are all bigger than he is, so the drivers choose them first. What's the engine's name, Daddy? Edward, he said. He then made me a small model engine, and I asked for stories about my engine. He said, okay, yeah, I can make up stories about your engine, but first it has to have a name. Why don't we call it Thomas the Tank Engine?
An island of talking steam trains, painted in bright colours with very unique personalities. Hot-headed James, who is always showing off and wanting to be the centre of attention. Edward, the voice of reason, an older engine, but still has what it takes to be useful. And of course, Thomas, the little blue tank engine, who's eager to prove himself, but his cheekiness can sometimes land him in trouble. What makes these characters so fun is how they interact with each other, each offering a unique perspective, and how each character always has something to learn. Not one of these characters is perfect. They're written like children from the playground, and of course, they are children's stories.
Children found themselves able to identify with the different characters of my engines.
The engines have human characteristics. Like children, faced with a prohibition, as every child does, they push it and push it and push it to see how far they can go without bringing trouble on themselves.
I called Gordon after a small boy whose name actually was Gordon, who used to play with my small son. He was a bossy type, and so Gordon, as a name for a bossy engine, was a natural.
Be careful now, he might well sue you for that, you know. If he's still
I haven't let out who he was.
Not a sound of the surname.
In the sad story of Henry, the big green engine misbehaves and refuses to do his work over something as silly as the rain, so the fat controller shuts him in the tunnel until he learns to be really useful again. at which point he's allowed out again. In James and the Bootlace, James is too rough with the coaches, treats them badly, and thus an accident occurs later down the line because of his actions. He's told off and he learns not to be so rough. In Thomas's train, Thomas is so eager and overexcited to pull a train of his own that he jumps the gun and manages to leave without it. He learns to be patient and wait for everything to be ready. They're simple, short, and easy to follow, with characters learning from their mistakes.
The children's books that he was given made a point, made a moral, thumped it home, and then after a little while they thumped it home again, and then they thumped it home a third time, and before you'd finished, you'd got a fourth time just for good measure. He was trying to be a lot more subtle than that. It was probably not deliberately to make the point, but to suggest the point.
This isn't unique to Thomas. Of course, pretty much all children's shows are built around morals and life lessons. The point is, these lessons are not shoved down your throat. Awdry didn't talk down to his audience. He wrote in a way that would appeal to a larger demographic.
Well, when you're writing a children's book, you're writing for a whole lot of people. Yeah. You're writing for yourself to make sure that you've got it researched right. You're writing for the unfortunate parents who've got to read it aloud time after time after time after time. You've got to put in little funny bits, subtle bits, which they'll enjoy. And then there's the simple slapstick stuff, which the child will enjoy.
Awdry based his books on real-life events, whether it was something he may have experienced, read somewhere, or seen somewhere. This helps ground his stories in a sense of reality.
It's more real than we could possibly imagine, and it seems to remind us of a world that is gone. As you look at those drawings, first drawn by C. Reginald Dalby, you see those green hills and the blue distant mountains and the sea beyond, and you see the cows strolling through the meadows, and you see the children standing alongside the line waving at the trains as they go by. That is an evocation of an age that is gone, and it's always created in glowing iridescent colours, and those colours and those pictures leap off the page at you.
This world of make-believe was, to a child, believable.
Did he ever intend, really, for it to be anything other than a story for his children?
No. It was about the farthest thing from his thoughts when they were created. It just sort of took life, really.
What first attracted me to the stories were and still are the characters, the adventures, the situations they get into. And this is what made me want to bring them to life on the screen, with all the things that a multi-dimensional world can do.
Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, as the show was known then, premiered in the UK in 1984, spearheaded by Britt Allcroft.
I was actually making a little documentary about the British love affair with steam trains, and during my research I came across an article about the Reverend Wilford Awdry and his creation from the 1940s. Anyway, we got chatting, and I looked at these little books. At that time there were just 26 of these very small books with very simple text and just beautiful watercolor paintings for illustrations. And I said to him, I really would love to bring these to life.
Together, Britt Allcroft and their incredible team created the original series of Thomas the Tank Engine.
All of us on the original Thomas team were completely united in the mission that we had and still have, to bring fun, comfort, and inspiration into children's lives through the enchantment of storytelling.
What I cared about was that little children who were sitting at home would really feel that this world existed and they could be there, that they could go there. And then someone said to me, you know, there's a guy who's doing a lot of commercials and he's got a yogurt commercial on at the moment. I thought, what's that got to do with, you know, steam trains? But I actually looked at this commercial and I met him, and of course it turned out to be David Mitten.
David Mitten was the director of the original Thomas and Friends series, and with him he brought energy, excitement and life to the show.
The filmic translations of these things are very difficult in many ways, because there's a terrific difference from a chap sitting on an end of a bed telling a little chap in bed, which you probably know yourself, where you can stop between sentences and really get into detail because he's asking you the questions. In filming it, you've got to explain all the questions filmically there so that there's no mistake, there's no misunderstanding, and the story is clear.
The engines themselves were Gauge 1 models that ran on model track, had moving eyes and live-action smoke effects.
Each miniature engine, and there are now 17 of them, has several dozen faces to capture the mood of the moment. But it's the eyes, animated by radio control, which give each engine a personality of its own.
You cannot talk about Thomas the Tank Engine without paying tribute to the genius of those grey, round faces.
They all have different expressions for whatever they're handling at the time. And so the servos inside there control his eyes, as you can see. So if he can go do a silly little thing, left and right, and of course, up and down, and actually, using this lens, which my cameraman and I designed up together, it can track with the engine, along the engine tracks as well, alongside it, with it, fly over bridges and track with it. It can do anything.
The colours they used for the engines stood out on the screen. With vibrant reds and perfect blues, they helped each character stand out from the rest. When the team introduced the narrow gauge engines, they decided to deviate from the books, which painted all of the locomotives red once they arrived on the Skarloey Railway. The show instead opted to keep Peter, Sam and Sir Handel green and blue respectively, as well as giving Duncan a unique yellow and Rusty his distinct orange, after his namesake, I imagine. Although this meant that one of the adaptations implies that the trucks are colourblind, it gave each character its own defined appearance, which again added to the beauty of the show. The sets were huge, bright, colourful and busy. They quite literally felt like a storybook coming to life. Everything was picture perfect.
But we have a passion for the island of Sodo, that the fluffy clouds are very important, friendly clouds, which match the character of Thomas.
The trees are always lovely and green and the flowers are always colourful. And Thomas lives in this land and he loves it. It's a child's image of how nature should really be.
Robert Gould Golliers was the art director for Thomas the Tank Engine. He designed sets and storyboards, and his illustrations were brought to life. The show featured a variety of practical effects, from snow to water, detailed crashes, and even explosions. Even though the mouths didn't move, everything felt so alive. Whenever anyone talks about old school Thomas the Tank Engine, undoubtedly Ringo Starr's name will come up.
He said, "Why me, Britt?" And I said, "Because you've got this great storytelling voice."
I read the books and I thought they were fabulous. You know, I thought they were really good books, and also the drawings in the book, the style of them I loved, and she convinced me that, you know, they were going to be animated in that style. You know, they weren't going to make them cheap looking, so.
Ringo Starr voiced the first two series for the UK and the US dubs before eventually leaving the show. He was then replaced by Michael Angelis in the UK and George Carlin in the US, who was then superseded by Alec Baldwin. Each narrator brought their own individual style to the role, with their interpretations of how the characters spoke and acted.
James was very rude whenever he saw them. Ugh, what dirty objects, he would say.
Really reliable. That's me, panted James. Pity the same can't be said for Percy. Goodbye.
Oh, please. Now, excuse me, Sir Topham Hatt needs me to pull the express.
Pah! Snorted James. Now, excuse me, the fat controller needs me to pull the express.
The original theme tune to Thomas the Tank Engine is so iconic. Everyone knows it, even though it hasn't been the theme tune for 20 years. The music of Thomas the Tank Engine brought the show to life. Beautiful music that felt whimsical and made these stories feel like a fairy tale. Each engine had their own unique themes that perfectly encapsulated that character. These themes also didn't remain the same from series to series. They developed and grew with the characters.
I think that, one of the reasons why Thomas was so successful, it was that it appealed to parents and grandparents alike, and the kids, of course. And so we were just trying to make the music not so kidsy.
The classic series of Thomas the Tank Engine at least starts off quite faithful to the books. Series 1, 2 and 4 being almost wholly adapted railway series stories. Series 1 introduces us to Sodor, nicely giving the core 7 characters, Thomas, Edward, Henry, Gordon, James, Percy and Toby, all starring roles, lifting stories from the first 8 books. When adapting the books for television, there were alterations, such as Edward's Day Out and Edward and Gordon being merged, as well as additional or altered scenes to accommodate the inclusion of other characters, most notably, of course, the titular character, Thomas.
Hello, Duck. Going fishing? I'd take care if I were you.
Some elements were made a little more kid-friendly. For example, this scene, when Gordon finds out steam engines are being scrapped.
Is it true, sir, what the diesels say? What do they say? They boast that they've abolished steam, sir. Yes, Gordon, it is true. What, sir? All my Doncaster brothers drawn the same time as me? All gone, except one. The guard's whistle blew, and Gordon puffed sadly away.
Is it true what Diesel says, sir? What does he say? That diesels are taking over? Don't worry, Gordon, that will never happen on my railway. And one more thing, sir. Why did the visitor have 2 tenders? Because he lives on a railway with long distances between coaling depots. Gordon felt better.
I think its use of characters was also very clever too. Having Bill and Ben be the engines that Percy spoke to in Percy Takes the Plunge, or Oliver being the engine Thomas is talking to in Thomas and the Special Letter. Of course, this was most likely done due to budget, but this made the island feel a little more contained. There were times we saw real-life engines, such as the City of Truro and Flying Scotsman, but that said, we only saw the tenders for Flying Scotsman as it was a plot point for the episode, and the City of Truro didn't actually have a face. The books initially were simpler, but as they got more complex and explored more of the island, the showrunners ran out of material, so they started to write their own stories.
Magic, being the content on the screen, free of any purpose other than to enchant children.
Infamously, the Reverend Wilbur Awdry wasn't best pleased about some of these changes.
Henry is enraptured by the forest which he goes through. The driver says to Henry, "We've made good time over the last section. Let's stop for a bit." Well, what responsible driver would stop as if he was in a roadside lay-by You can't do it. They've shown a lamentable ignorance of Rule 55.
Ensure that the signalman is aware of your position on the track. That's Rule 55.
So while the stories moved away from purely Railway Series accurate adaptations and moved on to original stories, those same crucial elements remained the same. The engines were still engines. They couldn't leave the tracks, and they were all still railway-based.
Percy's right, Duck thought to himself. Engines are happiest when their wheels are firmly on the rails.
Series 5 saw the addition of a railway consultant, David Maidman, to help the writers use real-life railway events to inspire the stories. The core of the show was still the same.
The morals of these stories were never jammed down the kid's throat. They weren't blatant. They weren't in capital letters. They were gently massaged into the framework of the show.
The show didn't tread the same ground. You had a variety of episodes, each with their own style and tone. Not every episode has a perfect, resolute ending. Some have an open ending, leaving the rest of the story to the child's imagination.
Duck still wonders about the lands beyond the horizon, but he enjoys being with friends most of all, and I think he knows that sometimes the best travels are those we can only dream about. Don't you?
I think the fascination for, certainly from the children's point of view, is that they can actually see it working. They can see the steam, they can see the rods moving, they can see the wheels moving. You get in a modern locomotive, a diesel locomotive, you press a button and it goes brum, and hopefully it moves. This you can actually see in action, you can see the power and feel it. And there's a sort of distinctive smell about a steam engine too. All the stories are based on actual railway incidents. Now, you can't fool kids.
One of the most famous parts about the UK is its steam engine heritage. Britain led the way in the Industrial Revolution with the use of the steam engine. Impressive engineering feats. Steam lovers feel that these engines truly are alive, as did the Reverend W. Awdry.
Then the two engines would start off up the hill. And the boy's imagination, you could hear the two engines talking to each other. I can't do it, I can't do it, I can't do it, I can't do it. And the banker behind, oh yes you can, oh yes you can, oh yes you can, oh yes you can.
They appealed to adults and children alike. All around the world, there are now many heritage lines that preserve the history of these beautiful steam locomotives. There is an undeniable fascination people have for steam engines.
They relate to what happens with all the characters, and they love trains. I think everybody all over the world, whatever their age, responds to the sound of a train whistle.
Thomas is a remembrance of things past, the clattering, clanking steam trains that talked and wheezed as they chugged by.
Each of us needs to do something to bring back real human flesh and blood contact and storytelling into every family's life. Yes.
Thomas the Tank Engine was truly a special show. And today, it still is. The show has survived for almost 40 years, albeit in very different forms, and there is now a new blockbuster slated for release in the future. The truth is, though, Thomas isn't the same as it once was.
You'll never find a story where, let us say, Thomas leaps off the rails and goes to rescue a sheep who's got stuck in a hedge, because engines don't do that.
The truth is, that story is not out of the realms of possibility anymore, and Thomas is a far cry from what it once was.
As far as the stories are concerned, that has changed, because on the one hand you have the originals that Father wrote, and on the other hand you have the new stories coming out in the latest series, which, while using some of the same characters, have a films, in some cases, have a completely different atmosphere.
Do you still look at those and relate to them in the same way as you do the originals that your father wrote for you?
Not really, because Dad always ensured that everything that happened in his books happened to some engine somewhere, sometime.
Who knows if this current track Thomas is on will be successful? Shows have to adapt. They have to change with their audience. The rise of technology, fast consumed content, shorts, and social media means kids' TV today sadly isn't as sustainable if it's slower paced and a slice of life. The show was a product of its time, and I'm glad it was created when it was.